are more prevalent now than they have been. One of the things I'm doing a family week this week, and so I'm looking at ending at like 5 till. Cam, can you hear me? No, she's not paying attention. But anyway, I'm going to watch and leave about 5 till so I can go over and do the closing for the family week. But anyway, eating disorders are thriving. They are strong. They're stronger than they have been ever, and it is a lot about the pandemic. People staying in. We're going on 2 years that people, have had to stay in, and then, for a while we were given the okay to get out, and now we're getting the information, don't get it, so y'all know the drill. And so people have stayed in, and then, we were told that there's going to be a shortage of food. It is, I wish Cam would click herself off. I'm looking at her talking to somebody. Anyway, I'll get myself back together here. But anyway, it is, we're told that there's going to be, and there has been, a shortage of certain food products and other products. And I've noticed in going to the grocery store myself that going for, I went the other day for blueberries and yogurt, and they were out. I had never known Walmart to be out of blueberries and yogurt. So, there's that sense of scarcity, that, there's not going to be enough. There's not going to be enough food. So we need to stockpile. And so for those who have eating disorders who, overbuy and keep the house full of food, there's just that instant temptation there. And, the National Eating Hotline for the National Eating Disorder Association reports that there has been an increase from 70 to 80% of the calls since the pandemic. So that just proves the point that eating disorders are on the rise, and it's, for years it's been known, or we've, thought, and, it's been, I don't know, certainly those of us who have been in the field have really attempted to educate people about eating disorders, and that it is not just white females that don't eat, that have anorexia. That's sort of the profile, the thought, when people think of eating disorders, that's what's been portrayed, and in magazines, and and it really started with Twiggy, the little model that looked like a 12-year-old little boy, short hair, the dresses were just draped from her shoulders. There was she was just a skeleton. And that really, I believe, is the beginning of young women particularly wanting to look like 12-year-old boys, no weight at all, nothing. And so, when people think of eating disorders, that's usually the first thought that they think of is someone that is underweight, that is an anorexic, and that, bless their hearts, and ain't it awful, that all they have to do is just eat, the thing that anorexics get that they absolutely do not need because it feeds into their disease, is that they get a lot of attention about being anorexic. Family members will do interventions on anorexics and get them help when a 300-pound compulsive overeater will be in the household for years, and no one would ever think to do an intervention on a morbidly obese person. Now they might say something like, you really are gaining weight, you might want to go on a diet, or why don't you push yourself back from the table, or why don't you just put your fork down and quit eating. They may say things with a critical tone in their voice, but even the medical profession, even the eating disorder field, so many do not recognize morbid obesity as an eating disorder. They still see it as a behavior. It doesn't even show up in the diagnostic book, How We Diagnose Any Mental Illness, the only way it shows up there is binge eating. Binge eating. Finally got in there. And of course, anorexia has been in there because anorexia, along with, and this has been added recently, anorexia used to hold the number one spot for the highest morbidity rate of any psychiatric diagnosis. Anorexia did. Now it's become tied pretty much with opiate addiction. But that's just kind of in the last few years. Anorexia has helped that as being the number one death killer of any psychiatric diagnosis. So a lot of times anorexics will get help when other people that are suffering from eating disorders don't, particularly your overweight people, unless they get so morbidly obese that their doctors will send them somewhere. And I'm so glad that we have Ann on, and I hope, and Ann, in your practice and in your work, that in your area that you help train therapists, because people will go with eating disorders, they will go to therapists. And I've had people come here that have sat in a therapist office for 10 years, and the therapist never diagnosed them with, maybe they weighed 300, 350 pounds. I've had them never address the weight issue. Or they, are bulimic and never address the disease of bulimia. I don't fault therapists, I do not. What I do know is many of them don't know how to recognize eating disorders and give appropriate referrals or recommendations, So it's not a fault-finding process. It is about people getting more educated about eating disorders. And, like I said, in the past, I hope it's getting better, but in the past, it was, generally white females and usually the anorexics that, that the attention went to. And we still see, and it may be other places, maybe this is just where we are, but we have treated very few African Americans, very few. Even when I was in in the alcoholism field 40 years ago, treating alcoholism and drug addiction, we saw very few African Americans. And now in the eating disorder field, maybe they go other places, but we've treated very few. Same with Hispanics. We've treated very few. We have treated some. And I think a lot of that is the prejudice of the family system, is a lot of it. And that African Americans, look, and I've talked to women, like in OA, in other parts of it, because we have, anyway, I've gone and done workshops or spoke to them, African American women that have an eating disorder, and they've said that that it was hard for them to see that they had an eating disorder because all the information goes toward white women that are underweight, severely underweight. So I'm kind of beating that dead horse to death. And so I want to talk too about eating disorders are real. They're absolutely real. They are not made up. They are, it is a brain chemistry, and if you came from a family where there was alcoholism or eating disorders, that there's a hereditary part of the brain that will set people up to have addictions. Sometimes alcoholism will skip a generation because the children will decide, or the adult children will decide, well, I'm not going to be like them, I'm not going to drink. And that was the decision I made until later on. But anyway, for many years, I made the decision I am not going to drink. But I started using food at age 4, and food did for me what alcohol did for my mother. It eased the pain of living. It took the edge off. And then, it's like any addiction. After a while, it took more food, and then more food, and then more food, and more food, till I ate myself up to 287 pounds. And so, I had the problem. I always knew I had the problem and sought help everywhere I knew to seek help. And mostly the help that I got was, from doctors, and I'm not faulting doctors. I still do not think doctors understand or are educated about eating disorders. But when you go to most physicians, if you're overweight, they will really encourage a diet and maybe even hand you. Used to, it would be 1,000-calorie diet. I wished I'd saved all of them, because I was handed many 1,000-calorie diets, and they'd say go home and stay on this and come back in a month. Well, that is really too low that's not even healthy for people to go on. So my point is, there still needs to be more education about eating disorders. It took us years, and I mean years, in the alcoholism field, going and doing workshops and fighting with the state of Texas, and and fighting to insurance companies, and where alcoholism was declared a disease, to get insurance companies to pay. In this field long enough that I was in those trenches, going in front of the senators and congressmen, trying to get laws passed where people would not be incarcerated for being alcoholics and drug addicts, but would receive treatment instead. I think we're behind this education somewhat with eating disorders. I think we're very behind it. I know I don't do enough. I really don't. That's why I want to talk about eating disorders today. I think, I own a treatment center, and we treat all addictions with a primary focus on eating disorders. So this is an opportunity for me to have a platform to talk about eating disorders. And so every once in a while, I'm committed to doing that. And if there's one person that might watch this or listen to it when it's on YouTube, and they can get some help, it's worth us, because like I said, I'm preaching to the choir. All of you know everything that I'm going to say, because you've heard me say it, and many of you are in good recovery. So, the deal about men are still, I don't think men are given as much opportunity to go to treatment. They still have that mentality that it's more of a female disease. We're seeing more men come into treatment for eating disorders. There is no shame in having an eating disorder. What we're seeing is compulsive overeaters, but we're also seeing bulimics. Now, the thing about when men get into the disease of anorexia, men wait so much longer to get help, I believe, than women do. I do not think the men still are given enough permission to get help in those early stages of any eating disorder. Particularly your anorexics, they stay out. Your anorexic men stay out so long, and usually they're not the ones seeking treatment, seeking help. It's the family. They're devastated, they don't know what to do, and so they get them help. And they too can recover, but it is tough, because that mindset, that brain is so set to the not eating, not feeding the brain, till what you deal with is mental illness. You're dealing with mental illness when the anorexia, and this is true with women too, when the anorexia is so severe that the brain is not fed, it quits functioning. And we can come up with a diagnosis for mental illness, but what it is anorexia with signs and symptoms of mental illness. So, with also then what we know in the field, this is not all the time, it is not with every eating disorder person, but with many of your eating disorder people, there comes a element of trauma in childhood, and that trauma can look in many different ways. It can look different. A lot of times when people hear trauma, they think severe, sexual abuse or physical abuse, and absolutely that is abuse. and but keep in mind, life and a day in the life of a child is much different than a day in the life of an adult. What happens, what is said or done to a child is much different than what is said or done to an adult, because a child has no filter. They don't know, their brain is not developed enough to know how to set a boundary, and some adults don't either. But anyway, a child, when something is said hurtful to a child, or if they're slapped in the face, or if they're, you name the abuse, it goes to the heart of a child, particularly if that child is sensitive. I think it goes to the heart of most children, but particularly your little sensitive ones. And those are the ones that are going to grow up and be addicts if they have that brain chemistry. And so trauma and eating disorders must not be overlooked. You must address trauma. But when I was in the straight drug alcohol treatment business, we treated, it was a nonprofit, and we treated a lot of low bottom alcoholics, drug addicts, treated a lot of parolees, treated a lot of them fresh out of prison. But there was a man, Joe McQuaney, who actually trained me in the addiction field. Went up to Little Rock, Arkansas, and stayed 6 weeks and was trained up there. And he had a man that was his director. and we all called him Mr. Lewis. Mr. Lewis taught me a lot about the brain of an alcoholic. He is the only one in all of the addiction treatment and education and workshops and all of that I went to my memory, Mr. Lewis was the only one that talked about the childhood trauma and how the alcoholism was set up for him in childhood trauma. And he said, and he called me Miss Tenney, and he said, Miss Tenney, you must take your alcoholic drug clients back to their childhood and see where the feeling, and he called it the feeling of no damn goodness. He said every alcoholic and addict has that feeling of no damn goodness. They feel bad about themselves. And he said you must take them back to their childhood, not to keep them there, not to make them feel sorry for themselves, but to get their history straight and to see where that pain started in their heart as a child. And he told me the story of his own childhood, and it affected his life in an enormous way. And so what he said was, his mom and dad, lived together. He had a brother about 3 years older, and his dad would get up, go to work every day, come home. They had a happy family, and he was about 4 years old. And what Mr. Lewis reported, that as a child, he could hardly wait till his dad got home, could hardly wait till his dad got home. And what his mother would let him do is run down to the end of the corner, and she'd watch, and he could stand on the corner and watch his dad get off the bus, and then his dad would run, pick him up, and carry him home. That was their daily ritual, and he looked forward to it every single solitary day, every day. It was a happy family. And then one day, what can look happy on the outside, if you really know what's going on in the coupleship, it's anything but happy. But anyway, one day, Dad left, and he told, Mom and Dad were having problems, and so Dad left, and he took his older brother with him. Mr. Lewis's older brother, who was about 4 years older, he took him with him and left the 4-year-old with the mother. From that point on, Mr. Lewis said he described, and he would describe it, that he took on such an anger and such a hatred for men all men because of what his dad had done. Mr. Lewis grew up and come to find out his dad was alcoholic, and and so Mr. Lewis, was a fighter. He was a street fighter. He would fight anyone. He would get angry. He started using drugs and alcohol, and he got worse and worse and worse and worse till he murdered a man. Murdered a man on the streets of Little Rock, Arkansas, and he went to prison. He went to prison. He said, I went to prison. What I was incarcerated for was anger. And it showed up as murdering another person. They will put you in prison for that. And so while there, he was combative. He said he was an awful prisoner. He did not, was not, because that anger was still there. And Joe McQuaney, who trained me like it was over the treatment center, would go to the prisons, and he would talk about the 12 steps and about God's love and his forgiveness, and he would talk about anger and all. And Mr. Lewis, because of his overdeveloped pride, didn't want to act like he needed or wanted any help from a man because he hated men. But what he would do, he'd sit outside the door of the lecture room, and he would listen to Joe talk about the 12 steps and talk about about God's forgiveness and how he can forgive us of anything, regardless of what, he was talking to criminals, regardless of the crime, that God could forgive. And he would talk about their childhood and what happened to them in childhood. And Mr. Lewis said he didn't know what was happening, but he'd sit there at that door and listen, and pretty soon all those prisoners, those big old tough, rough people, some of them had been, murderers, they'd been robbers, but he said, Joe would get them all crying. Every one of them start crying, because what they would do is they would remember the precious child within, the child that was there before the abuse started. And that's the work that we do here. That is the very work that we do here. And that's what Joe told me. And this was early on, before we were taught about doing any kind of inner child work. That no one was talking about it at all. But Mr. Lewis did, because he said, had he not heard outside the door a man, not a woman, but a man talking about God's unconditional love and positive regard to us as his children. He said he sat there day after day, or whenever Joe would come, and those, there's my friend Bill. I was getting ready to call you because I haven't been seeing you on there. I'm glad you showed up. I was going to call you. But anyway, Lewis would sit there and listen and listen and listen, and those layers began to come off, because he did want to get well. Long story short, him and Joe became good friends. Joe started a counseling training there in that prison. Mr. Lewis took it, and then, another long story short, because of Joe and a lot of other people in the state of Arkansas, Mr. Lewis didn't have to serve out his entire time. And he immediately when he got released from prison, he went to the Serenity House in Little Rock, and he started working with other addicts. And he's the only counselor, now hear me, that I sat at the feet of for years that ever talked about our childhood and to encourage us to take the client back to the childhood. Because if you don't get to that core pain, the core pain of childhood does not cause addiction. Do not hear me saying that, it does not. But what it does, we start with that core pain that, where we feel embarrassed, where we can't talk to other people, where we don't feel worthy, you name it, all that low self-esteem stuff that has been implanted and inbred in there as a child. And I will tell you, I don't believe parents intend to do that. I think that they do. I always say that I don't believe parents wake up some morning and say, well, today's the day I go screw up my kids' lives. I think parents harm children out of their own ignorance and out of their own childhood. They pass on what was given to them. So, but I want to go back to Mr. Lewis. It wasn't really Joe, it was Mr. Lewis that would talk to me once we started the Serenity House. You know, I was program director. We did not have a program. They taught me how to implement it, and we'd implement it, and Joe would call me and then Mr. Lewis. But when Mr. Lewis would call me, he'd always say, he said, when you look at those rough, tough old drug addicts and alcoholics, he said, when you look at them in the eyes, you see that little child inside of there, because that's the one you're going to have to reach. You're going to have to reach that little child within. So I said all that. I didn't even know I was going to talk about Mr. Lewis, but evidently I needed to do that. We traveled some together, Lewis and Joe and the assistant director at the Serenity House. I had the privilege of going with them throughout Texas and doing workshops, trying to train counselors and therapists and social workers and people in child protective services. We'd go anywhere to help educate them on drugs and alcohol and the effect it was having on families and children. And remember going down to Huntsville Penitentiary and with those 4 men or 3 men and myself but I felt very safe traveling with those 3 men. And you know, we were down there to train parole officers on how to treat alcoholics and drug addicts. But the state of Texas would wine and dine them at night, and they would have wine and they would party, and they didn't want to hear us talk about drugs and alcohol. So the system was broken. The system was, anyway, I'm getting off on a whole different thing. I'm getting on my bandbox. I'm getting off of that. My point is, trauma is important with eating disorders. You must look at the trauma. And it doesn't have to be anything great big. It can be something as small as a parent's look. My kids have told me, and they still tell me, that they say today that I don't have the look, but you know, that they knew that I meant business when I gave them the look, whatever the look was. And they said that, we've been talking about this week in Family Week, how that they would just shrink on the inside when I'd give them a certain look, that they would feel like that that I did not approve of them. And it was usually about how they looked or how they dressed or how they spoke. I wanted my kids were an extension of me, and I was overweight. I couldn't buy clothes that looked good, but by God, my kids looked good. And when they went to school, people would tell me all the time, or to church, they would tell me, oh, your children are so beautiful. How do you do it? They always looked like they stepped out of a bandbox. That was my selfish way of getting compliments, because I felt so bad about myself. And so if they didn't look a certain way, I would give them the look. And then what they have told me on the inside, that they would take on that criticism, and then they would begin to criticize themselves. Except one, I had one that didn't, and y'all know Miss Kim, she did not take the criticism. I mean, she danced a different tune, and she dressed the way she wanted to. She might leave the house looking frilly and cute, but underneath that dress, she would have rolled up pants or shorts. The minute she got to school, she'd take that dress off. We went through a period of time at the elementary, they couldn't wear pants. And Kim wore pants more than she wore dresses, because she would wear a dress, get to school, pull that dress off, put it in the locker, and wear blue jeans. And the principal would call me. Today, Kim's here in jeans. It's a rule. They can't wear jeans. They have to wear dresses. I am so glad they changed that stupid rule. It doesn't matter what kids wear. Anyway, I've really changed my way of thinking after my kids got grown. They said, oh, sure, now you think like that. My way of thinking for kids is let them dress any way they want to. Because, like for instance, if a kid wakes up some morning and they can't decide if they want to wear, maybe they take dance lessons and they can't decide where they want to wear ballerinas to school or a cowboy boot. And so maybe if they're 5 or 6, they decide to wear one of each. And by the end of the day, the criticism from their peers and a blister on their foot is going to teach them pain is a very good lesson learner. And by the end of the day, they're going to realize that ballerina slippers is for dance. It's too flat to wear on the street. That boot is uncomfortable unless you have 2 boots on. So if parents will give kids some room to explore and have adventures, to do pretty much not anything that will harm them or but to be who they uniquely are and not try to put them in a mold. We get eating disorder people here all the time that are so mad at their mothers for putting them in such a strict mold that they really couldn't get themselves out of that mold by. Now, your bulimics a lot of times, but your drug addicts and alcoholics will get themselves out of the mold. They'll dress any way they friggin' please to, make the mom, it's like one up to the parents. But eating disorder people, a lot of times it's hard for them to do that. So it comes out, that anger, that rage at parents will come out many times in their bodies. They will get into eating disorders and they will eat themselves to death, or they will starve themselves to death, or they will eat and puke themselves to death. And it's all about, this is simple, I'm simplifying it. It's all about unresolved trauma and anger of the past. Now, you got to take them there. You got to get them, having to realize that they're not their abuse and quit living out that story. But that takes time. It takes a lot of time. And in the meantime, I do believe in order to work on the trauma, they must be working on their eating disorder, because the eating disorder is what has helped push those feelings away and put them deeper and deeper and deeper. So there's a balance. I think that it's very important, and I know, and I'm mentioning Ann again, that's the type of work that she does with her clients. And we've been fortunate when she comes up with a client that she feels like she can't take any further at that point, she'll send them here. And she knows what they're going to get here, and then we send them right back to her, and she picks right up where we left off, and that makes good therapists. And that's why you have to be very careful at the therapist you choose. Don't find a therapist that, you can if you want this, that you go and sit in a chair for year after year after year and just talk. Talk therapy, it does good to get your story straight. And it can have some value, but after a while, there needs to be different types of therapeutic interventions in order to get to the trauma. Expose it, get it out of the system. It's almost like purging it out, purging out the pain and the anger that you've carried all of your life. Okay, so eating disorders are they are progressive diseases, they are chronic diseases, and they are fatal left untreated. They are progressive, they're chronic, meaning chronic. You're going to have, and I believe this, there are people in the eating disorder field that do not believe this at all. And I'm for whatever anybody else believes. But I know, as far as having an eating disorder all my life myself, it has brought me to this realization is that, I'm in good recovery from an eating disorder that almost killed me. I celebrated 36 years in September. But I am not arrogant enough to think that I could never have it again, that I am completely over it. I live in wellness every single solitary day of my life. And I still do some of the exact same things toward my recovery as I did in the early days. It's about you treat addiction like repetition. You do the same thing over and over. Prayer, meditation, invite God in of a morning, ask Him for another day of abstinence. And also make it a short prayer and ask God to put someone in, I ask God, put someone in my life today that I can help. You put someone. It might be in Walmart, it may not always be people that show up in the therapy room, but God put someone in my life today that I might be able to help. Short prayer. And then get up off my knees and do what I was taught to do, and that is go about my day and feed myself appropriately. That means feed myself 3 times a day. And sometimes I'll do that snack at night, and sometimes I don't. I did it for 3 years, I don't know, but I don't always eat that snack at night. But I eat the 3 balanced meals a day. I get some moderate exercise, and I live my life. That's been going on for 36 years. But I'll tell you, I believe with every shred of consciousness in my being that if I quit doing those things, I would go back and tap back into that eating disorder like that. And I'm not willing to chance it. Why should I take that chance? Why not take, do those 5 things every day to recover? Prayer and meditation, read some kind of program literature every day, because we have a brain that forgets. A brain of an addict, we have a forgetter of the things that help us. So read some kind of program literature, and then go do your job, do what, in your family, be a part of society, and then have a sponsor and work these steps. And that is an ongoing process. And sometimes if you come up with another problem, other than just that's why we treat all addictions, because many of us, including me, have switched addictions. I'm in good recovery, and I could list them, y'all have heard them, but I've had to address every one of those process addictions separate. And that's been in recovery from my eating disorder. So you've got to be aware of when you switch over, I'm not eating, but then I can work myself to death, or I can get into love and sex addiction, or how about going to a casino and do a little gambling, I've never tapped into the gambling, but, it's still out there. I'm not a sex addict, but, who knows? If we don't stay in fit spiritual condition every single solitary day, we will find something to ease the pain of living. We will, because we're addicts. We know how to do that. We'll find something out here to bring in here to ease the pain of living. So that's why we work the 12 steps with the sponsor, and then sometimes we have to get sponsors in this program. You got to get with people who understand the problem that you have. Otherwise, they'll just let you slide through. Oh, well, that's no big deal, honey. Go eat a Snickers bar. If you try to talk to an alcoholic about your eating disorder, they can, they'll say, oh, yeah, but, it's no big deal. It's no big deal. Here, have a candy bar. Or if you try to talk about your alcoholism to a normie that can drink wine, they'll say things like, just drink 1 glass of wine at dinner. Just drink one. I'll sit here and watch you, and you just drink one. That's why you have to be real careful who you talk to about any addiction that you have. And like I said, I'm repeating myself, that's why we treat all addictions here, because I've seen it happen over and over and over and over again. People will get recovery in one area, and if they don't treat the codependency, which is the root of any addiction, I believe, is the codependency, we will find something else to ease the pain, and that will be a process addiction or another substance. We've had them, and statistics show it. This is not anything I made up. the big deal. And I am not totally against the bariatric surgery. It's a tool. That's all it is, folks, is a tool. But the ones that we get here, it has not worked for because they've eaten through the surgery or they have traded off. Research has shown that about 35% that have had the bariatric surgery have become alcoholic because the metabolism changes and it does not take much for them to absorb the alcohol and become alcoholic. And this is a big problem with people who have the surgery. All right, I could go on and on and on and on, but anyway, I guess maybe I needed to talk about this for myself to really enforce and remind me of what we're doing here and why we do this. We have some of the most ill anorexics in treatment that I've ever seen and ever treated. And this disease gets so ingrained in the brain, it is a way of life. And the fear that particularly anorexics or any addict, the fear of giving that up keeps them in it because they do not know that there will be any life after the disease. That is their life. And I'm here to tell you, and every one of you on this screen, I know you because, I know most of you. I know you. I know you inside and out in a lot of ways. And you're treating a deadly disease. And that's what it's going to take. But you had to surrender. You had to admit that you had it. And we can do that first step till hell freezes over. We can admit we're compulsive overeaters, bulimics, anorexics, and nothing changes. You've got to be convinced that you have it. If you're not convinced that you have it, you'll never treat it. You'll never treat it. Once you get convinced that you have a deadly disease, if you have any of your mental faculties left, you're going to treat it. And we see it over and over and over and over. And relapse is not the worst thing in the world for a person because sometimes people will not ever be convinced that they have the disease until they suffer a near-death relapse. Am I giving you permission to relapse? Absolutely not. But sometimes it takes that for the disease to be put right in their face. So I'm going to stop preaching, and because I've stopped sharing and gone to preaching. So let's open it up, and y'all talk about your recovery. Talk about any roadblocks that you come up with. Talk about if you've switched addictions. Anything you want to talk about. Let's have a few minutes to share. Who wants to start? Hello?